You're listening to TGI Sports Talk with your host, Keith Angle, on Northeast Streaming Sports.
Good morning, everybody. Keith Angle for TGI Sports Talk right here on the Northeast Streaming Sports Network. How are you today? Beautiful morning in East Greenbush here. Gosh, it's been a couple of gorgeous days. Actually got out to play some golf with a buddy of mine I haven't seen in a long, long time. Yesterday we had a blast. Played golf last Saturday with somebody I hadn't seen in 25 years. So it's been quite a week. Busy week here personally and professionally. And again, I want to thank all of you that will join us this morning live and all of you that will, watch later on in the groups that allow me to share this. With the subject matter today, we're going to have a lot of groups that will be interested in what we'll talk about today. The groups that I belong to anyway. I want to thank my guest from last week, Derek May, former Major League Baseball player with the Cardinals and the Cubs and a few other organizations, a current manager of the Frederick Keys team and the Major League Baseball Draft League. And since he talked to us, they've won a couple games. So, Derek, we may be your good luck charm, and we'll have to have you back. And maybe if we have you every day before a game, you'll probably go undefeated the rest of the year. I do not hold any illusions that I had anything to do with that. Anyway, guys, my guest today is Dan Epstein. Dan is quite a writer. Covers. It's hard to you can't. I don't think you can pigeonhole Dan really because he writes everything about pulp culture in the. He's got books about pulp culture in the 60s, the 70s. I think the 60s, 70s, and we don't want to talk about the 80s. I just found out, but he's written for Rolling Stone. He's been a contributor to the LA Times and some outlets that I'm not familiar with, but some of you more enlightened people maybe with Mojo and Flood. But we'll talk to Dan about that. And he's written some great books about 70s baseball and weaving in that pulp culture aspect to it. They're really, really fun reads, and we'll talk about those. Big Hair and Plastic Grass is one of them. Stars and Strikes is another, and we're going to talk about his current endeavor with Ron Bloomberg called The Captain and Me, about Ron's relationship with Thurman Munson on and off the field. And with that, we'll bring in Mr. Dan Epstein. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Keith. How are you?
I am fabulous today. I'm glad to see you with us. No technical difficulties, knock on wood yet.
Not yet.
Obviously you've done this once or twice because you're right on top of things. It's always challenging because I often don't get a chance to talk to my guests before we hook up just before the show, and sometimes things don't go as planned. So.
No, I'm an old hand at this kind of thing at this point.
I'm sure you are. Dan, tell us a little bit about Dan Epstein and what got you to the place you are today.
Wow, that's how much time you got.
You only got 30 seconds to do it, too.
Well, basically, I wanted to be a writer since I was in my early teens. Way back then, I thought I wanted to be like a news reporter. And then I got lured by the demon siren song of rock and roll and started writing about that for like my high school paper. And, one thing led to another over the years. And I, became I guess what they used to call a rock critic. And that was my main line of work for a number of years. And around 1999, 2000, I decided that there needed to be a good book on 1970s baseball because that was the era that I fell in love with the game. And I felt that, I was a huge fan of baseball books and was always looking for one that really kind of looked at that era with the same kind of appreciation that I felt for it, which was that this is not a aberration. This is not this is not something weird that we probably shouldn't pay too much attention to. I felt this was an era that really we're still feeling the effects of today. It was filled with amazing characters, amazing games, amazing incidents, and needed to be appreciated in all its glorious weirdness. So Big Hair and Plastic Grass came out of that about 10 years later. It took me, 10 years to, I wasn't writing it the entire time, but it took a long time to find a publisher because I had no background in baseball writing. And then, went through the usual dance of finding a publisher and then being dropped by the publisher and then picked up by another publisher. So I wrote that, and then that kind of paved the way for Stars and Strikes, which was my book about the 1976 season. And that in turn led to The Captain and Me with Ron Blumberg, which was, this is a different kind of book because it's collaborating with a player. And then in the meantime, I've written, lots of other things, as you mentioned, for lots of magazines and outlets, and
you may be the only person alive who's written books with you have Oscar Gamble on the cover of Big Hair and Plastic Grass, but you also wrote a book about Buck Owens, which we talked about the other day. And you may be the only person on the planet who's included those two people in your work, among others.
I'll take it.
So we'll dive into the other 70s books, because I definitely want to talk about them. But being it's more topical, let's talk about The Captain and Me. Which is, as you said, you wrote in collaboration with Ron Blumberg, and it's about his relationship with Thurman Munson on and off the field. What was the genesis of this project? How did it come about, and you and Ronnie hooking up? And Ronnie's been a guest on the show, great guest too, by the way.
Yeah,
and,
great guy.
How did that meeting come about in this collaboration?
Well, it actually, I have to credit my friend David Jordan, who actually has just published a great book with Dave Parker called Cobra, and Dave's agent is Ron's agent, and Dave had mentioned to me that Ron was looking to write a book, and maybe he and I should talk. And at the time, I was just thinking, like, I'd just come off a couple of projects where I'd worked with a couple of other collaborators in the music business, trying to tell their stories, and those projects didn't go anywhere. So I was a little leery of getting back on, because it's a lot of work to write, to work on a proposal, and then it goes nowhere and you don't get paid for it. And but anyway, so David was like, look, just talk to Ron. He's, at the very least, you'll have a fun conversation. And I'm like, you know what, you're right. And I'd always been kind of interested in Ron's story. I'd read his book Designated Hebrew, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, good book.
And again, it's like any chance to talk to a player from the 70s, my wheelhouse. Why not? So we were talking, and we hit it off immediately. And he had two books in mind, and two book topics in mind, and one I didn't think really, it wasn't clicking with me. But then he was talking about Thurman, and Thurman Munson was my favorite catcher when I was a kid. I wasn't a Yankees fan, but I loved Thurman, and of course was completely, distraught when his plane went down in 1979. But I didn't really know much about him other than, what was sort of, on the surface. This tough guy, didn't like to shave, didn't like to talk to reporters. Great player.
A complicated guy, really.
And so the more I talked to Ron about Thurman, and I had no idea that they'd roomed together, that they'd lived in the same building for a while in Jersey, that they basically, off the field, like they socialized with each other more than either of them socialized with any other players on the Yankees while Ron was there. And then Ron started telling me about his own, his injuries and, that whole hell that he went through pretty much for 2.5 years. He was on the DL,
Yeah.
and how Thurman really like was the one guy on the Yankees who looked after him, who stuck by him, who encouraged him, who was just like, "Don't give up, man. You can still do this." And that really touched me, and that really was like, okay, that's not a side of Thurman that I know. And if I don't know it, then probably most baseball fans don't know it. So, I felt like, okay, this is a story we should tell. It has a very kind of odd couple feel. Ron, as you know, is very gregarious, very just, loves everybody. Just, this sort of beacon of sunlight. And Thurman, as we said, has this kind of rough reputation, and yet they found a lot of common ground together and really kind of stuck by each other through some pretty tumultuous times, both on the field and off.
Yeah, I thought you did a great job of bringing out who Thurman really was. I mean, what people saw, as you said, growing up in the 70s, you don't see behind the scenes. We didn't have ESPN. We didn't have all these great books that are out now about that era. And Thurman looked, and from all accounts, was a what's the word I want to use? Was a grumpy guy, right? And
yeah.
he could be cantankerous with reporters and whatnot, but nobody saw the other side. You saw the great ball player. He was obviously a great ball player, but this book really brings that out. And so you did a great job there. And you said this was your first really collaboration with a ball player, right? The way you write the book, I found interesting too, is you did some narration around Ron's story, which I enjoyed both parts of it. How did you decide how to go about that piece of it? Or is it that question to answer? I don't even know.
No, I mean, that's a good question. In fact, that was something I was stuck on for a while because, Ron is a very, Ron tells a great story. He's got a ton of great stories.
Oh, gosh, yes.
But he's not, like a lot of players from, whose last game was 40, 45, 50 years ago. Like, he's not like, if you say to him, what was your batting average at the end of this season? He has no idea.
Right.
What was Thurman hitting? He has no idea. And, why should he? It's not, that's for guys like us,
right.
To keep track of. So, but
Sadly, I can tell you those things.
but I also felt it would be dishonest to have him saying those things in the book. Like, I finished the season hitting 311. It's like, I know you don't know that. So like, I'm not going to put that I'm not going to put those words in your mouth. So Jesse Jordan, who was our editor, I had some conversations about this, and he was actually the one who suggested that I should kind of step in as narrator, and the way I kind of envisioned it was like the book is like you, me, and Ron are at a table, at a booth, at a delicatessen, and Ron is going off on his stories, and every once in a while I'll chime in and be like, actually, this is what happened. This was the guy who hit that ball. This was, this was what Thurman was hitting. This was when he won his first Gold Glove. That kind of stuff, because it's like, and then also that way I could get a little of my own voice in there, which was fun.
Yeah, and you did a great job in interweaving that. And the way your explanation actually really hits home, because I couldn't really put my finger on how I felt, reading the book, my place in it. But not as you say that, and I think back to it as I'm reading, it felt like that I was there listening to this conversation. And it was a lot of fun. Tell me, and we'll start with Ronnie, I guess, because and it's so when you and we first connected. I guess after I had Ron on the show, and you talked about coming on closer to when the book was coming out, and I thought about having you both on, but I figured you wouldn't get too many words like that. So I do want to get Ron back on. He actually wants to come on, and I did want to do it with you because I did want to chat with you too. And Ron's a great guy, but man, he can go.
He's big.
Yeah. So what about Ron Blomberg did you learn? I mean, I learned a lot in reading his book, Designated Hebrew, and just interviewing him that I did not know about Ronnie. And He's a good guy. What was your big takeaway about Ron?
Well, obviously I'd read Designated Hebrew as well. So I, so there are a lot of things like on the playing side that I, already understood. But I mean, with all my books, I'm interested in not just what happens on the field. I'm interested in the lives these guys led.
Yeah.
And because I always say baseball isn't played in a vacuum. It's not, and it's not played by automatons. It's like, or I mean, maybe it is now, but in the 70s, like that, these guys had a lot of personality, a lot of things that kind of spilled over into the outside world, or the outside world spilled over into their lives. And with Ron, I had no idea about his and Thurman's close friendship with Nat Tarnopol, who was the president of Brunswick Records, which was, nobody remembers Brunswick now, but unless you're a record collector. But in the 70s and 60s, like they were a big label for R&B and soul music. And Nat, who I already knew of, he was a connected guy, and as many people were in the music business back then, so there's a lot of kind of mob interaction with him.
I was going to say, you mean connected the way I'm thinking of connected?
Connected. So, it was interesting to hear Ron talk about. I mean, like Nat was his and Thurman's best friend outside of, the baseball world, and they were hanging out with him all the time. And as a result, they were hanging out with some pretty heavy duty individuals. And, Ron says, and I believe him, that these mobsters did not, they kind of looked at him and Thurman as novelties. They were Yankees fans. They got a kick out of hanging out with ball players. And there was no funny business going on. Like these guys made very sure not to involve them in anything dubious, not to be like, yeah, we're going to whack this guy tomorrow. Just thought you ought to know. There was just they were very, it was very compartmentalized. And then, on top of that, I had no idea what a music fan Ron is, and that he grew up grew up in Georgia, going to see James Brown and Otis Redding, and and I'm a huge music fan and a huge soul music fan, so it was great just to kind of bond on that. Ron would always throw out these these singers' names or these groups' names, and would be totally shocked when I'd be like, yeah, I know who Bohannon was, and so that was a really nice connection between me and him. And then he was telling all these stories about him and Thurman going to the Apollo Theater up in Harlem to see the Shy-Lights or Jackie Wilson or whoever. And again, this is a whole new dimension to these guys that I had no idea about, and I don't think most other people did either.
It is an interesting thing. And Ron coming to New York, I mean, was it? And I remember reading in his book and talking to Ron that he felt the Yankees, really wanted to capitalize on him being,
Jewish,
a Jewish superstar, right? To be, was it that big a deal for bringing in eyeballs at that point in time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, New York City had the largest Jewish population in the country.
Yeah,
and and he was signed by the Yankees in '67, so this is right after Sandy Koufax retires. And obviously, Koufax was more of a star in LA than when he played in Brooklyn. But there was still this sort of this void of a Jewish star in baseball at that time. And the Yankees also did not have a good reputation as far as inclusiveness, shall we say. I mean, they were one of the last teams to sign up to bring a black player up to the majors. And Elston
Howard was the first one, right?
Yeah, Elston Howard. And, and Elston was an amazing player. And of course, that was always the Yankees thing. Well, we're just waiting for a great black player. We're not,
Right.
So so they knew, and the other factor is that the Yankees in 1966 were terrible, and so they weren't getting a lot of people out to Yankee Stadium because they were going through pretty much their worst period in Yankees history at that point. And so it was kind of like, well, at the very least, if we've got a really good Jewish ball player then on the team, then we're good for a few thousand more tickets per game, and that adds up at the end of the season.
Well, let's move over to the Thurman side of this story. So obviously, we talked about the fact that Thurman was, Ron was pretty straightforward. It seems. I mean, you pretty much you did learn a little bit, obviously, about the music and all that. But I mean, with Ron, what you see is what you get, pretty much, right? I mean, he's, like you said, he's outgoing, and Thurman's not. Thurman's a more complicated guy. What were some of your big takeaways about him? I mean, obviously, Thurman's a great ball player. We all know that, and Dave Guyette, who I believe is his biggest fan, will always never miss an opportunity to say Thurman needs to be in the Hall of Fame. And there's days I totally agree, and there's days sometimes I have my doubts, but great player no matter whether he's there or not. Tell me some of the things that you kind of took away from learning more about Thurman.
Well, I mean, you're completely right. He was a complicated guy, and Diana Munson, Thurman's widow, very generously wrote the foreword for her book, and even in her foreword, she said, like, he was an enigma. Like, she feels like she didn't even fully know him. And, he kept a lot of stuff inside. He'd had a rough childhood, really developed a hard shell, or mostly hard shell. I mean, you could be very sensitive. So there are a lot of things that even she didn't know about him. That Ron talks in the book about how he and Thurman used to go to the child cancer wards of the various New York hospitals and hang out with the kids and give them signed baseballs and try to cheer them up. And this was definitely something I never knew that Thurman would get up to. And it makes sense because Thurman didn't want to publicize it. Thurman didn't even tell Diana about this most of the time because he didn't want it getting out there that, like, he was a big softy when it came to kids. And, so that was a very sweet thing that I learned about him. But I mean, you talk about what a great player he was. I don't think I fully understood. Obviously I knew he was a great player, captain of the Yankees through their kind of 70s dynastic period, but I don't think I really understood, just like on a granular level, how great he was, and how Ron would tell me these stories about Thurman never went over scouting reports on hitters. He just absorbed everything. He would, a guy would come to the plate. Thurman would observe how he reacted on certain pitches, and that was it. And then he would just store this information. Same guy would come to the plate 4 months later, and Thurman would know how to pitch him. It was like instant recall. Ron refers to him as a computer in pinstripes, and I think that's that's a pretty good assessment. So it's like, and also the way that Thurman handled pitchers, because again, this is not something you really got from watching games back in the 70s. This is not something you really got from reading interviews in the newspapers or Sports Illustrated or whatever. Just like this, like how important Thurman was to that Yankees pitching staff, and how many pitchers really became better pitchers because of working with Thurman, and that he would be able to, and it was sort of like, we talk about this in the book, like if you did what Thurman said, if you were a pitcher and you took Thurman's advice, you threw the pitches he wanted you to throw, like, you would do well, and then you would internalize this, for further on in your career. And then there were the guys who didn't follow Thurman's advice, and paid for it in one way or another. Losing games, getting knocked around, and in some cases, like the guys who were really stubborn about taking Thurman's advice, eventually got traded.
Yeah, it's funny the way you describe Thurman and his computer-like mind. I remember a passage in the book where they were in spring training, and Ron was talking about the fact that he wasn't playing. I can't remember who he was sitting with, but they were joking around, looking at the women in the stands, and whatever ball players do when they're not playing. Right. And Thurman had come over during a spring training game and chastised them both for not paying attention, and Ron in particular, I guess, for not paying attention, because you're going to see this pitcher down the road, and you should be watching what he's doing and how you expect him to pitch you. And that's a kind of cerebral comes to mind. And you don't think about that when you watch Thurman play, right? Because when he played the game down and dirty. But he was a cerebral player, if that's a good term to use for him, I think.
No, I think, excuse me, I think it is a good term. And, and he was just, Thurman was one of these guys who just he played to win. It wasn't like it wasn't just for the love of the game. He wanted to win and wanted to win every game. And, he's this intense competitor, and he was always looking for the edge, legal or otherwise. I mean, there's, we talk, there's all this talk in MLB right now about, the sticky stuff and the pitchers, using the stuff to grip the ball. Yeah. And there's a passage in the book where, Ron talks about Thurman using sticky stuff, but in a different way. He would put it on the back flat leather flap of his mitt, and then he would take gravel from around home plate, because of course, the field was less manicured in the 70s than it is now. Yeah. So he would find gravel, and then he would rub it on the flap on his mitt, so there would be all these pebbles just kind of stuck to it. And then when a pitch would come in, he would, he had very quick hands, and so he would kind of, before throwing it back, would rub it across the flap on the mitt and scuff it, and then throw it back to the pitcher. And if the pitcher, like Catfish Hunter, was, a guy who could really use a scuffed ball to his advantage, then he would have this scuffed ball for the next pitch, and be able to make it dance a little more. And so, yeah, I mean, Thurman just was always taking in everything and kind of synthesizing the information and then doing something with it.
I thought about that passage when this whole thing started blowing up here the last few weeks, and I have very strong opinions that, I don't have really a problem with pitchers trying to, pitchers and hitters have been trying to get an edge on each other for 130 years, or ever how long that game's been around. I can't do math very good this early in the morning, or ever. But every rule change since 1968 has been in favor of the hitters. The mound lowering, the fields are smaller, the designated hitter, the balls got harder, the bats got harder. Pitcher's got to get an edge somewhere where he can, and I really don't have a problem with some of the stuff that's going on. I mean, that's a story for another day, but I did think about that passage as this whole thing's going on. I did a vlog last week where I just kind of exploded, and my head, I don't even know. My head might have literally exploded during that vlog. I'm not sure, but
they're still picking up the pieces.
I am. Yes, there are pieces of me laying all over this office here. To finish up with the book and that era and Thurman and Ronnie and those Yankee teams, I really think those Yankee teams, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more as we dive in maybe the other 70s books. Those Yankee teams, they became great at 76 on when Billy came in and, George started having more influence, free agency, all that. But those teams that Thurman and Ronnie grew up on, I think get a bad rap. I mean, they weren't great teams, and CBS didn't put a lot of money into the team. We all know that, at least for Yankee fans or baseball fans of that era. But they were not horrible teams. They won 93 games in 70 or 71. I think 70, yeah, and finished 20 games behind the Orioles. There were some Oriole teams that, the Yankees were in pennant races a lot of times and into August and then faded. or the Orioles were just that good. But I think those teams get short thrifted a little bit with that derogatory, the Horace Clarke years. There was some good baseball played at times.
I think it was just a matter of them not having all the pieces they needed. And I think, like you mentioned, when George Steinbrenner comes in and he and Gabe Paul really kind of set about putting, assembling that championship team. And, the Yankees were in the hunt, quite a few years in the first half of the 70s. And Thurman was a huge part of that, obviously. And, you look at those teams and it was pretty much the same team every year with a couple of slight alterations. And that was kind of the deal with CBS. They would go and, they'd make a few trades, but and obviously, like, whoever they had scouting for them, they were doing a great job, finding and signing guys like Thurman and Ron. Yeah. But it was just, they weren't doing the blockbuster deals. Starting in 74, the Yankees start, with the serious makeovers. And, and we talk about that in the book, like the play, pre-Steinbrenner, Ron and Thurman and their teammates were always bitching about how CBS wasn't willing to spend money. They weren't willing to do the big deals. And then in 74, they do a big deal with Cleveland, where they trade away half their pitching staff, half their starting pitcher to get like Chris Chambliss and Dick Tidrow and Cecil Upshaw.
Ripped at the time. I remember that trade being paying bad.
Oh, ripped by the Yankee players. I mean, this is the first time where Thurman says, "Trade me to Cleveland," because he's so angry that these guys, that they consider family, are gone, and he doesn't, if the Yankees are going to do this, then they may as well trade me to Cleveland because, I can play near my home, and it's interesting to kind of think about that sort of disconnect. It's like we want to win, but at the same time, these guys are our family, and we don't want to see our family members traded. But obviously, they got over that.
Well, Chris Chambliss wasn't the player in Cleveland that he became with the Yankees. Obviously, he was a great clutch player. It's funny you talked about the same faces there year after year, and except for a few. And the problem was the few different faces would be guys like Celerino Sanchez and Rich McKinney and guys that like could not play. So.
Right, or in the case of Rich McKinney, just like didn't show up to play, or showed up and forgot to bring their glove. Or
it's very funny. I remember very little about Rich McKinney until I read your book. I did not know a lot of these things, that he was just an airhead. I just thought he was a bust that they blew horrible treatment for Stan Bonson on. But I learned a lot.
Probably more than you'd want to know, right?
So that was interesting. And I just want to point out here, Timothy Hughes says it's a shame that Ronnie wasn't around for those series titles, and I can't agree more. I mean, you talked earlier about the things that he went through injury-wise after 74, 75, whatever it was, but he missed most of 76. And
I mean, and that's a real, that's kind of the heart of the story, or part of the heart of the story. Anyway, it's like you have these two guys, Thurman and Ron, drafted a year apart, come up to the Yankees, about a year apart. And these guys are supposed to be the building blocks of, the Yankees' return to glory. And as it turns out, Thurman is one of those building blocks. And Ron is a great player, but he just keeps getting injured. And, it's every player's dream to play in the World Series. Every player's, since they're a kid, they envision themselves in the series. And so, like, it's bad enough that Ron had to miss 2.5 years, dealing with various injuries, and injuries that he got from, going 110% and running 50 miles an hour into a wall and things like that. It's not like, like he hurt himself slipping in a hot tub or something. And then he has to sit there and watch Thurman and these guys that he's, been playing with for years, go to the playoffs, go to the World Series, win the World Series. It's in '77. So, I mean, that plays a big part in why he eventually decides to declare for free agency and move on to the White Sox. Like I think in his heart, he knows it's not ever going to be like it was with the Yankees. But at the same time, there's this fear, like, I've already had these two massive injuries. Everybody thinks I'm jaking. Everybody thinks I'm just taking the Yankees' money. What happens if I go out in spring training next year with the Yankees, play my hardest, hurt myself again, and I'm in the same situation all over again? So, it's sort of this, it was a very hard emotional decision for him, but, he was so scarred from those 2.5 years on the DL that he really felt he needed a change of scenery. And Thurman was, I think Thurman knew that it wasn't going to be the same for Ron either, but, he was very supportive of, whatever you need to do.
I was very hopeful when Ron had signed with the White Sox that he was going to, a change of scenery was going to do him good and he'd get healthy and have a big year, because those White Sox teams will start morphing a little bit more now, I guess, into some of the 70s baseball in general that we read about in Big Hair and Plastic Grass. Those White Sox teams that he signed with were very interesting teams, with Bill Veeck running the team, and they were the Southside, what they call them?
Southside Hitmen.
Southside Hitmen, right? Really fun team to watch. I mean,
that 77. Excuse me, that 77 White Sox team was so much fun. I was not, I hadn't even been to Chicago at that point, but I remember like sitting, I have this very vivid memory of sitting in the clubhouse of the golf club that my grandfather belonged to in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Indian Hills Golf Course. And he was having a post round of golf drink with his friends, and I was just kind of sitting there enjoying the air conditioning and leafing through the issue of Sports Illustrated. I guess it would have been like early August '77, that had the article about how both the Cubs and the White Sox were in first place at that point, and just how Chicago was just exploding with baseball pride. And of course, like, the Cubs are doing well, but the White Sox were the real story. Bill Veeck, taking guys like Richie Zisk and Oscar Gamble, who he traded for, like, knowing that they were going to play out their options and he probably wasn't going to be able to re-sign them. But it just all came together in this team that, like, they couldn't run, they couldn't field, they weren't great at pitching, but they could hit the ball, a mile. And so, and that was the year that Nancy Faust, their organist, started playing, na na na, hey hey, goodbye, like after every time they'd knock an opposing pitcher out, and it just seemed like such a party. And a couple of years later, my family moved to Chicago, and I was so excited because I just decided, like, well, Bill Veeck's the coolest. I'm gonna be a Sox fan. And then of course, by the time I got there, the whole Veeck era was, on its way out. And also I lived on the north side, so I became a Cubs fan instead. But by the time Ron comes to the team in '78, it's a whole, it's unfortunately a whole other story already. I mean, Zisk and Gamble are gone. Veeck tries to pull the same trick with Bobby Bonds and Claudell Washington, and it doesn't work. And Ron is his big free agent signing, and that doesn't pan out either. So that's really, there was really that one shining year with the White Sox, and then it's over.
Yeah. When it comes to '70s baseball, Dan, I mean, it's funny. We went from the '60s where things seemed all buttoned down. You watch games. I watch a lot of old games on YouTube because,
Sure.
I've got a 90-year-old man hidden inside my 60-year-old body. My wife says there's a 12-year-old boy and a 90-year-old man trapped inside my 61-year-old body. But
I can relate. Yes.
There's a lot of nights I just want to watch an old '70s game, and you watch some of the games from the '60s, and there was this transformation pretty quickly as we hit the '70s, right? We get the double knit uniforms, and and big hair, as you mentioned, and AstroTurf. What was the impetus of this? I mean, it was a colossal change, kind of in the approach to the game and the personalities.
Well, I think part of that has to do with what's happening in America and what has been happening in America outside of the game. You have the whole upheaval, societal upheaval of the 1960s and the kind of pop cultural explosion. And baseball is like this, in the 60s, it was kind of like it was covered with this membrane that prevented all that from getting in and really kind of impacting the game at all. But by the 70s, a lot of that spills over. You have a lot of players who went to college in the 60s, in the late 60s, and college campuses being a hotbed of upheaval in many ways. And now they're bringing that to the major league ballpark, and they're very, they're much more, expressing themselves comes much more naturally to them than the players in the 60s who were very, kind of buttoned up and give the, not really letting their personalities, not letting their freak flags fly, basically. And the players who come up in the 70s, they're much, it's a different breed of player. And there's, as a result, you get so many interesting characters in the 70s. And as a kid who, I was 10 years old in 1976. So what had happened before that, so I get into baseball in 76. And so I start kind of obsessively learning about, the seasons that had happened previously, while watching, the guys on the field in 76 and on my TV and reading about them. And, it doesn't occur to me that this has not been the way it's always been. That, it's like, oh, AstroTurf, oh, colorful uniforms, oh, afros, mutton chops, mustaches, this is the way it is. And then only once I start reading about earlier days, I think, one of the first baseball books I read after I became really interested in the game and its history was Roger Kahn's The Boys of Summer, which is about the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 40s and 50s. And it was like reading that, it was like, oh, wow, this is a whole, at that point it was only, 20, 25 years earlier, but it was a whole different world. And so, it really, that's when it started to click, like, okay, this is a new thing. This is a revolution in its own way. And again, when I wanted to write, when I decided that I wanted to write what would become Big Hair and Plastic Grass, it's like I want to celebrate this. This is a whole, you look at Ken Burns' baseball, and it's like the 70s is in and out in about 5 minutes. We talk about Hank Aaron breaking Babe Ruth's record. We talk about Carlton Fisk, his home run in this Game 6 of the 75 series. Talk, I think, about Pete Rose, and then it's let's just
I was
move on.
I was very disappointed in that, because again, like you, I'm a big fan of the 70s. My formative years, I'm 6 years old. I start to remember things when I'm 10 years old. So the 70s were very important in both the growth of me and my love of the game. And obviously the game's a whole lot different than it was played in the 70s, and the 70s were different than it was played in the 50s. But
right, but you look at the 70s, and there's so much impact that decade had on the way the game is played now. Whether it's from the way teams started to use the relievers to free agency, and the economic changes that, especially free agency, the economic changes that brought. We're really still feeling the effects of that today, but also the way that, if you remember in the 70s, we were lucky if we got to see 2 games, 2 games a week on TV. There'd be Monday Night Baseball, game of the week on the weekend, and maybe, if we were living in the right part of the country, we could, see 1 or maybe 2, whatever the local team was on the local, network affiliate. But now, I mean, everything with the MLB network and all the cable deals and all this all comes out of the 70s.
Good point. It's funny you mentioned economic change. Obviously, a big change with free agency and salaries just start to rise and haven't stopped. But even with all that, and more money being thrown around and players moving around a lot more than they ever moved before, both on their own and with trades. I mean, the decade was really dominated by a handful of teams. The Orioles to start the decade, and the Reds, and
Pirates.
The Pirates, the Yankees, the Phillies, obviously.
Yeah.
And then you had the Dodgers, and you had a few interlopers, the Red Sox in '75. But why not more parity in the '70s when all of this upheaval was happening and player movement was, unprecedented up to that point anyway?
That's a really good question. I think, a lot of it had to do with, the team ownership, it wasn't, there weren't, there wasn't the kind of money being thrown around, at least in the first half of the decade, that there was in the second, but I think those teams that were so dominant they had really savvy organizations. They had minor league systems that were, they knew how to stock with players. They knew how to make the trades. I mean, I think the Yankees are a good example of that, where it's like, they have all these prospects, who are really solid coming up in the 60s and early 70s. And then when they, make the ownership change to George Steinbrenner, they can parlay those prospects into trades for, the right pieces of the puzzle. So, and the Oakland A's, I mean, Charlie Finley was, not a great person, and certainly in terms of labor relations, not a very sympathetic figure. But at the same time, like he pretty much did, he almost single-handedly built those A's teams. And so, I mean, you just had the guys who were savvy, and then you had the guys like, Ted Turner, who came in, who, had a lot of money, but, didn't really, it took a while for him to kind of, get the right people in place in the front office to bring in the right players. And, so the Braves in the second half of the 70s are all about the wacky promotions and, and wet t-shirt night and stuff like that to get people to the ballpark.
I still remember Ted Turner signing Andy Messersmith and putting giving him the number 7. I think the channel was 17, giving number 17 and putting channel on the back of his jersey instead of his name so he could get some free advertising.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that again, that's like, part of what I love about 70s baseball. It's like, in no other decade are you going to have an owner who, puts nicknames on the back of all the players' uniforms and tries to advertise his own TV network on the backs of his players' uniforms. Obviously, was not able to keep that going for too long, but it's just one of those things that made it so much fun to watch.
Yeah, Timothy Hughes brings up a good point about divisional play coming into play in '69, and it did. Obviously went on into the 70s, and more teams were in pennant races later in the season. So yes, and I think that spurred a lot of fan interest in the cities that weren't maybe had it before, but
it was still the same teams. I mean, it's like it's like NL East. It's the Pirates or the Phillies.
Yeah,
the entire decade, and there's a little more parity in like the AL West. But
the two teams when you think about it, it's the A's or the Royals most of that decade, right?
That's true. It's the Angels in '79. The AL East, I guess, is a little more. It's probably the most. Think about it, that's probably the most diverse bunch. So you've got Orioles, Yankees, Red Sox, Tigers. in '72. But even so, it's like the Orioles are, Orioles win it 4 years, or 3 years. Yankees win it 3 years. Yeah, I mean it's still pretty, and I mean there are interesting races through all that. I mean we talk about the White Sox in '77. They gave the Royals a scare, and and the Yankees obviously were in the hunt in '72 and '74. But it just things it always just seemed to be the same 5 or 6 teams out of the bunch that were in the conversation.
What's interesting about those teams that we talked about too, I mean, they were, for the most part, very different type teams from the Orioles. I mean, certainly the Reds were different than the A's. We all know that.
The Hares versus the Squares.
Right, Hares versus the Squares. And you go to Pittsburgh, and I mean, they're just loaded with Black and Latino players, really, really good players as well. The Yankees, I mean, are certainly a different bunch, but I think there was a lot of similarities to those Yankee teams and the A's teams in the 70s, and just the variety of personalities and the conflict that they had with amongst themselves, but using that to fuel their success in a way, I think.
No, it's and it's interesting that two of the main characters on the Yankees in the second half of the '70s were dominant players on the A's in the first half. Catfish Hunter and Reggie Jackson, and we talk about that in The Captain and Me, where Catfish Hunter and Kenny Holtzman are both already on the Yankees when Reggie comes over, and Catfish kind of rolls his eyes and to tell lets his Yankee teammates know that things are going to be a little different now that Reggie's in the picture.
Yeah, that was, I mean, that's a whole story in itself with the Yankees and Reggie getting there. We probably don't have time to get into that whole thing today, but maybe another day.
Sure.
Just that decade, though, again, you talked about the personality. We just talked about the teams. You touched on the personalities before, but I mean, and there were some guys who didn't have long careers, but they're remembered well past the '70s. Like, I found it interesting, your email address. I'm not sure what the doc is. I got to ask you.
Doc Ellis.
Okay, I thought it was. And Fidrich. Obviously, Mark Fidrich is one of the is just an iconic figure from the '70s, and his career was like a year and a half, basically.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's really one of my all-time favorite ball players, and part of that was because I was a kid in Michigan in 1976, which was the year of Bird Mania. So like that, we were hip to what was going on with that before the rest of the country, because of course, like the news spread a lot more slowly in those days. And I mean, it's been over 40 years since he last pitched in the major leagues, and it's been over a decade since his untimely passing. But yeah, he's still you wear a Fidrich jersey in Detroit, and you make friends for life just for walking to a bar with a Fidrich jersey. I mean, it's he's still just like you say, iconic. And there are a lot of guys from that era who maybe there's Oscar Gamble, another good example, Doc Ellis, their stats aren't good enough to, they didn't have Hall of Fame careers, but I mean they're Hall of Famers in my heart, man.
I totally agree. There's a lot of guys like that. Randy Jones is another guy that comes.
Sure, the junk man, and
guy couldn't break a pane of glass, right? But God, he had a couple of great years.
Yeah, and was so much fun to watch pitch, and that's the thing. Bill Lee and the Spaceman, that's the other thing. Like, these guys weren't just good players. They were so much fun to watch, and there was a joy that they brought with them onto the field that was palpable. I mean, even in Dick Allen, a guy who really got excuse me, really got a bad rap in his day. But like, that guy, you look at the footage of him playing, and he was just so much fun to, see just like strut up to the plate and this larger than life character who could, hit the ball the proverbial country mile. Dave Parker, just like, the list goes on and on. And I just don't think that there has been another decade in my lifetime that is filled with so many, fun and compelling players.
It's funny to bring that up because as we get ready to wrap up here, I wanted to touch on, obviously, and it was the players that really started that, not the owners. The owners went kicking and screaming into recognizing and promoting the players, I think, right?
Right.
But I feel like today there's something missing. That joy that you mentioned. And the personalities, we don't see them. And I love Derek Jeter. Don't get me wrong. As a Yankee fan, Derek Jeter is a great player, first ballot Hall of Famer, and you can't argue any of that. But I feel like I watch a bunch of Derek Jeters. He wasn't the most, his personality wasn't just bursting out. Just a great player. And I feel like I'm watching teams full of Derek Jeters today with, just going out and doing a workmanlike job, which is fine, but there's not, the flair's not there.
Yeah, and I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. I think some of it is the money. Nobody wants to jeopardize their, being set for life with their contracts by, being, some kind of what's the word I'm looking for? But by being flamboyant or controversial. I think a lot of it's also just like the culture. I mean, these guys, so many of these guys come up through, it's not like the players came up in the 70s. These guys, spend their lives playing on travel teams and, college baseball, and it's all very kind of focused, and they're very, and then there's, we see all the time with this, tiresome argument about playing the game right, and there's a lot of pressure on players to be sort of conform to this particular way of playing. And of course the players from Latin America who are much flashier and do bring that kind of exuberance to the field get criticized for, flipping their bat or pimping a home run. And so I feel like you can't have it both ways. You can't get down on players for not playing the game the right way and then also want color and excitement in the game, because playing the game the right way is not very exciting.
Good point. It's funny. I find myself in that trap sometimes because there's things that happen today that I don't like, and then I complain what I just said, that, the personalities aren't there that were there in the 70s. So right. I have to catch myself in my own hypocrisy there a little bit. So, anything else, Dan? Before we wrap up today, I know I'd love to have you back on just to talk more about 70s baseball, because we talked a lot about the new book as I wanted to, but I would love to have you back on to talk more about 70s baseball.
Sure, absolutely. No, this was a lot of fun. And obviously I can, talk about this till I'm blue in the face.
And we didn't get a chance to talk about some of your other stuff. If there's anything you want to push from, your other, you've got a lot of books out about pop culture and stuff like that. People can find them on Amazon, and I've downloaded a bunch of your stuff on Kindle here since we first hooked up. So is there anything else you want to kind of mention before we?
No, that's really it. I mean, obviously, I'm super proud of The Captain and Me. I'm really happy that it's, it's been so successful so far and has found an audience. And, it's I think it makes a great Father's Day gift. Excellent. If that ship hasn't sailed already. And I think, it's it was a real honor to work with Ron, and, going through I would say that was one of the things that got me through the awfulness of last year and the pandemic was, being able to talk with Ron twice a week, and, always hung up with a smile on my face. And I think anybody who reads this book will, take away some of that Ron Bloomberg sunshine.
Yes, I agree. They will. Definitely, you guys. And I'm going to get on there and write myself a review on Amazon. I haven't done that yet. And I
right on.
will do that.
Much
And,
appreciated.
I'll put a link to the book on TGI Sports Talk as well. So
Awesome.
great job, Dan. If you want to chat, I'm going to wrap up the show. If you want to chat for a quick second, if you got to run, I understand. I'm going to wrap it up. If you're there, we'll talk for a quick minute. If not, I understand. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's a blast.
I could have gone till noontime today, I think. So we'll talk some more. Thanks again. Bye-bye. Hey, guys, what a great interview with Dan Epstein. I can go for hours talking about 70s baseball. I can go for hours talking about the Yankees of the 70s and Ron Bloomberg in general, Thurman Munson in general. And I want to thank all you guys who are here with us live today, all of you that will see it later. I'll be on Sunday with my Stream of Consciousness show. We'll be talking more NHL playoffs. We'll be talking Yankees finally maybe starting to turn things around. NBA playoffs, everything you can think of. And I'll be back live next Friday with a guest to be named later. We'll talk to you guys later. Have a great weekend. Bingo. TGI Sports Talk right here on Northeast Sports.